Psychologists, have you ever been frightened by a patient? Once, when I was a medical student, I was asked to go see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my clipboard and asked the guy what was wrong. After that question, he turned a dead stare in my direction, with frothy saliva dripping from the corner of his mouth, and replied, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was very sweaty, and his clothes had dark red and brown stains on them. The door was behind him, and I wasn't sure if I could get there before something bad happened. I have no idea if he had a weapon hidden on him. What I did know was that I was afraid to call for help out loud, since I was in a quiet corner of the emergency room, and I didn't want to disturb the other patients. Also, since I didn't want to upset this man either. I stood there for half an hour asking him more questions. He curled up on the side as he began to look drowsy and fell asleep. I have 2 degrees in psychology, and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of scary behaviors, but nothing scared me more than caring for this 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been discharged from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to acclimate his behavioral medications. But in the short 2 weeks I cared for him, I feared for my life. He kicked, bit, scratched, punched and spat. He would chase me with knives, hit cars, and scream loud enough that the neighbors thought he was being abused, all the while destroying his mother's tidy apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a child could give him, she dismissed me by saying I was wrong, and that he just needed someone more attentive. Complete denial. I am a clinical psychologist. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate who was a member of a very feared gang in the country. By all accounts, he was the highest ranking in his group. In fact, he was locked up in that prison so that his gang would not go crazy and keep the peace in the place. He had a long violent history, and in my opinion, he was a real psychopath. Part of the evaluation consisted of talking about his crimes, assessing remorse, and all that, to which he was quite cynical in his description of how he tortured and left a man to die for an unpaid debt. "Live by the sword, die by the sword," was his phrase to justify his act, as if it had been nothing. He was very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while he was inside. I believed him. My recommendation was not to put him on probation. I gave several reasons, and in the end, the parole board accepted my recommendation. Then, the part that really scared me, this was my first parole evaluation, was the possibility of what he could do to me from outside the prison. I could have sent someone to my house if I wanted to, I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry, that this man knew the limits and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time believing them. A few months later, I was running a group for offenders and we were having meetings for their long-term recovery, and he was part of this group. After the first meeting, I pulled him aside and asked him if we were okay. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job, and I don't blame myself for writing the report I did because it was true. He went on to be a member of the meetings, really insightful and active. A lot of these guys basically understand that we exist in the system, but we're in a different role than they are. They might kill a guy for owing them money because it's part of their world, but they don't get mad at the prosecutor who sends them to jail for a decade, because that prosecutor is not part of their trade. It's an interesting disconnect. I am not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psychiatric ward as security. We had a huge man with schizophrenia detained in Ward 1s, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit to integrate into society, and therefore not allowed to leave. When I say he was a huge man, I mean he was almost 6 feet tall with gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. He was a really nice man when he was medicated, but when he was in psychosis, he was not someone you wanted to confront face to face. Sometimes we had to call the police to help us deal with him. If he got to an officer, he would look at him, say no, and call for backup. One day, he was guarding the entrance to room 1. He looked quite calm, so he was not confined to his room, and was allowed to walk around the space where the others are, although he was obviously supervised. He put down his magazine, went into his room, and then came out naked. The man came up to me, stood about an inch away and looked at me, I mean looked down, since I'm only 170 centimeters tall. He told me he wanted to leave. I asked him if he would like some shoes or a robe. He said no, he was leaving immediately and I had better step aside. So I did. He had better believe I wasn't going to be behind him. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where basically everyone gets pinned down, and goes against the wall to step aside, and out into the parking lot while I was on call with the police. I couldn't leave the area, so once I realized I was off hospital property, I could only inform the police where I was running to. At that point, he was heading into the center of a densely populated city. Not even 15 minutes later, he came back and entered the lobby of the ward and asked for me. After all, he wanted some shoes. I brought him some shoes to keep him from getting violent, and he left the place again. Luckily, when the cops brought him back, they put him back in his reinforced room. So we had assembled the whole security team, which was me and about 5 other guys. I decided to hold one leg because I'm small, and legs are easier to grab. So we entered the room in a triangle formation, with me being the last to enter. He must not have seen me when I walked in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and started freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes to restrain him, before he was medicated enough to calm down. It had been 2 years since this event. I was no longer security or living in the city, but I had gone to a metal show. I joked with my friends, saying that I was worried that someone I had dealt with at the hospital might recognize me there and have bad memories of me. And in that same spot was the former MMA fighter sipping tequila shots at the bar. The only thing I hoped was that he wasn't medicated while drinking, but it had been 2 years, and I didn't know anything about his current state of mental health, so it didn't matter. I tried all night to avoid him in case he remembered that I was the shapeshifter. At one point our seats overlapped at the bar, and I ended up standing next to him. He looked at me, looked down, and focused intently on me. He was puzzled. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell he was trying to remember where he knew me from. All night I could see him hovering around me, staring with this confused expression on his face. His last memory in the psych ward would have been me, a shapeshifter, holding his legs while a nurse put a needle in his butt. I don't think he would have wanted to say hello to me, and he was a little scared. I'm a therapist, not a psychologist, in case that matters. I used to work in an inpatient facility for children and adolescents, with fairly intense behavioral problems. Even when a patient became aggressive, I could usually de-escalate them and I wasn't the one who felt in danger. In fact, most of the time I was concerned for their safety during these scenarios. With one exception, I had a patient who was quite strong and was prone to intense tantrums. One time, this guy was acting in a way that was not normal. I thought he had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, so I had to put him in restraint, within sight of the staff at all times. His response was to run at me and try to strangle me. Fortunately, the staff arrived in time and prevented this boy from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same boy also dismantled the iron rod from his bedroom curtain and threw it towards my head. Luckily, I dodged it in time. Oddly enough, this patient and I had a pretty good relationship the other 90% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with him. I am not a psychiatrist, but my father is a retired coroner. He has too many stories, but his first murder case decades ago as a rookie was difficult. It involved a guy who was insisting on dating a girl. She made it clear on numerous occasions that she wasn't interested, but the guy wasn't getting it and kept harassing her. Finally, one day he followed her home, where he stabbed her parents and the family dog to death. I really didn't want to hear any more about any of his other cases. I am a clinical psychology student. I have never been afraid, but my friend had a patient who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that would break confidentiality, I will say that this patient had problems with touching himself too much and, at one point, asked my friend if they could watch pornography together in the next session so he could show her how he acts. At another point, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching himself a bit through his pants, totally inappropriate behavior. Obviously, this patient had many other issues, but when these things came up in front of her, her supervisor took my friend off the case because this was not appropriate for training, and my friend did not feel safe. When I was studying psychology in my senior year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Basically, I sat down and talked to a man in his 30s who was a sex offender. He told me that he used to marry women and then raped his daughters, Each one was usually between 6 and 7 years old. I was listening to him explain this and, due to my professionalism, I was not supposed to judge him. Besides, before working I was made to sign a document. I then asked him about the home life of those he abused. He said that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case, there was an older sister who was 13 years old, but he never touched her. He would regularly drop her off at school, where he told me he never liked the kids he saw there, and while she wasn't at home, he would come back and touch her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really wasn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it was about the dominance and power that comes with having sex with them. However, he is now being rehabilitated. The strange thing was that I wasn't sure if he was acting out of guilt, or just faking it, but if he was a good actor. He was very open to my questions and expressed his regret, and I almost believed him. However, I once knew a man who was convicted of having explicit child content. His words about feeling terrible about his actions were so full of bullshit it was disgusting. When I was doing my undergrad, my professors warned me about this manipulation, so it was easy to understand, but with the patient above, either he was an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he really wanted to get better. I used to work as an assistant in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, most of my caseload was 8th graders, and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One boy assaulted a girl in his class in front of a bunch of other classmates. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden to be with that girl anywhere, including the lunchroom. I spent a lot of time basically babysitting this kid, and since he didn't give a shit about school, he did virtually nothing during his time in the classroom. Last I heard, he had been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a gun. But what scared me was that he behaved in a completely antisocial manner, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others, when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. Finally, we had to warn his parents ahead of time, so that they would not take him to school during those events. All of this was done while he was on medication. I remember one of the teachers was pregnant. She was not his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day this child asked me, would Mrs. X's baby live if someone hit it with a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked, what if someone cut her stomach open, what if they stabbed her? This really scared me, and I had to inform the special education teacher. When I told her what happened, she said that I had asked her and other students the same thing, and it had scared them all. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him, in case he did or said anything to upset her. The wife of a good friend of mine is a psychologist at a well-known prison, and she sees people seriously fucked in the head for a living. She is usually always briefed on the relevant details, prior to being assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimony, and so on. She has heard recordings of murders and other disturbing things. She is a hard-nosed woman, and I guess she loves to psychoanalyze scary psychopaths. She once had to be pulled off a case because she was very uneasy, disturbed and felt danger from one of her patients. Apparently, this guy was either a serial rapist or a murderer. She couldn't give many details, but this guy only targeted a specific profile of victims, and she fit the profile. He started behaving strangely with her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and try to give her gifts and things. That was what he usually did to his victims, or well, as much as possible given the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his being peculiar like this to her, that she was even afraid to be alone in the supermarket, and she began to feel uncomfortable at home at night, even though this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described the man as someone who acted like a hunter with his prey. She was taken off her case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest with me. This is one of the dangers when you work with people like this. While she may talk about her patients as if they were lab rats, this was a case that you could tell really bothered and frightened her. I am not a psychologist, but I saw firsthand a mental breakdown in my ex that left me speechless. He had just started taking medication, and this medication reacted horribly with him for some reason. Most of the time he would have hallucinations, but others he would black out or do things and not remember them. For example, he would call me screaming at 3 o'clock in the morning and then not remember for a second. I had had hallucinations before, but they became increasingly dangerous with these medications. In particular, I think of one experience I had while talking on the phone. For a moment, he said, I boiled some water. I asked him why, since it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and he replied with eerie calm, they told me I had to put my hand in there. It was absolutely terrifying. Finally, I begged him to go to the hospital the next morning, to ask for a change of medication, and he reluctantly agreed. While he was there, he started vomiting blood and had to have his stomach pumped. It turned out that he had swallowed the entire bottle of his medications.